In the dusty mining town of Millbrook, nestled in the Colorado Territory, a young woman stepped off the evening train, unaware that her unique gift would soon unearth the town's deepest secrets. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Bennett had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, but her uncanny ability to detect lies would soon reveal that Millbrook's success was built on corruption. What began as a hopeful new chapter quickly turned into a dangerous battle between truth and power, one in which the only ally she'd find was the principled sheriff, who would come to mean far more to her than she expected. As the Denver and Rio Grande train hissed to a stop at Millbrook Station, steam rose into the crisp mountain air. Clara, clad in a plain brown dress and clutching her old leather satchel, peered through the window, nerves fluttering in her chest. Among the waiting townsfolk stood the man she'd agreed to marry, William Morrison, a rancher whose letters had promised a quiet life on the outskirts of town. Clara stepped onto the platform, legs shaky from the long journey and the uncertainty ahead. At 24, she had left behind a hard life working in her aunt's boarding house in St. Louis, trading drudgery for a chance at something better. Morrison, tall and weathered, approached with his hat in hand and a practiced smile. "Miss Bennett, I presume?" he said, extending a rough hand. "William Morrison, welcome to Millbrook." As their hands met, Clara felt the familiar electric tingle her grandmother had once called it a gift. The sensation always came when someone was lying, and now it surged with clarity. Morrison was who he claimed to be, but his friendly words were laced with dishonesty. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," she replied carefully, pulling her hand back. "Please, call me William. We're to be married on Sunday, after all." The deception deepened, though Clara couldn't yet tell what he was hiding. Morrison took her trunk and led her off the platform. Nearby, a group of well-dressed men argued near the station house. One stood out, a portly man in a fine suit, gesturing with authority. "That's Mayor Richard Blackwood," Morrison said. "Fine man. The mine's been good to all of us thanks to him." But once again, Clara's gift told her otherwise. The words were smooth, but the truth behind them was twisted. Even Morrison might not realize his own falsehoods. As they rode through Millbrook, Clara took in the sights: a bustling main street, freshly painted buildings, and signs of wealth everywhere, from the glowing windows of the Silver Dollar into the well-stocked shelves of Hayes General Store. The town appeared prosperous, just as Morrison had described. Still, each mention of the mayor or the mine stirred the same uneasy twinge inside her. They passed the sheriff's office, where a dark-haired man stood in the doorway, a badge catching the evening light. His steady gaze met hers, and for the first time since arriving, Clara felt something other than suspicion, something like trust. "That's Sheriff Hayes," Morrison said. "Good man, though he pokes his nose where it doesn't belong. Still thinks like an Easterner." Clara didn't miss the subtle lie in Morrison's voice. She stored it away, already piecing together the puzzle forming around her. Morrison's ranch sat a few miles from town, a modest but well-kept property with horses, a barn, and a cozy house. As they arrived, Morrison mentioned his late wife Sarah, who had fixed up the place before dying of consumption 2 winters earlier. But even as he spoke of her, Clara sensed another falsehood. He wasn't telling the full truth about Sarah's death. Inside, the house was tidy and warm, filled with touches that spoke of a woman's presence. Morrison showed Clara to a small bedroom where she'd stay until the wedding. Everything seemed proper and respectful, yet the unease continued to build. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the house and its owner were keeping secrets. Over a simple supper of stew and cornbread, Clara tried to learn more about Morrison and his plans for their life together. But behind his every answer, she felt it again: deception. And she knew this was only the beginning. His answers were polite but vague. and every statement seemed layered with half-truths that made her head ache with the effort of processing them. When she asked about his late wife's illness, Morrison's entire demeanor shifted, and the deception she sensed became so strong it was almost overwhelming. Sarah was always sickly, he said, not meeting her eyes. The mountain air didn't agree with her constitution. Dr. Morgan did what she could, but some folks just aren't meant for this life. Clara nodded sympathetically, but privately she wondered if Sarah Morrison had truly died of consumption, or if something more sinister had befallen the woman, whose personal belongings still filled the house. The thought sent a chill through her, and she began to question the wisdom of traveling so far to marry a man she clearly didn't know at all. After supper, Morrison announced that he had business in town and would return before morning. As his wagon disappeared into the darkness, Clara found herself alone in the house of a man she was beginning to fear might be dangerous. She lay awake that night, listening to every creak and groan of the old house, her gift making it impossible to dismiss the growing certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Morrison returned as promised, bringing with him fresh supplies and news from town. He seemed in better spirits, chatting amiably about the upcoming wedding and his plans for expanding the ranch. But Clara's unease only deepened as she realized that even his cheerful morning conversation was threaded with deception. "I thought we might ride into town today," Morrison suggested over breakfast. "Let folks meet my intended bride. Maybe stop by the church to speak with Pastor Wright about the ceremony." Clara agreed, partly from politeness and partly from a growing need to understand what was happening in Millbrook. Something was wrong here, something that went beyond her fiancé's mysterious lies, and she felt compelled to discover what it was. The ride into town gave Clara another opportunity to observe Millbrook in daylight, and what she saw only added to her confusion. The town appeared prosperous and well-managed, with new construction evident in several areas and a general air of success that seemed to contradict her growing sense of unease. Yet as they passed various citizens, Clara found herself unconsciously cataloging the deceptions she sensed in their casual greetings and pleasantries. At Hayes' General Store, Morrison introduced her to Martha Hayes, a kind-faced woman in her 30s who welcomed Clara warmly and insisted on showing her the finest fabrics and household goods the store had to offer. Martha's genuine pleasure in meeting her was a relief after Morrison's constant deceptions, and Clara found herself lingering in the woman's company. "You'll love Millbrook once you get settled," Martha assured her, folding a length of blue calico. "With practiced efficiency, it's a good town with good people. My brother Tom, he's the sheriff. He works hard to keep things peaceful and fair." As Martha spoke of her brother, Clara sensed nothing but pride and affection, a refreshing change from the undercurrents of deception that seemed to permeate every other conversation she'd had since arriving. When she mentioned this feeling to Morrison later, however, his response was tinged with that familiar sense of falsehood. "The Hayes family's well respected," he said carefully, "though sometimes I think the sheriff takes his job a bit too seriously. Small town like this, things are better left alone." The warning in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, and Clara found herself wondering what Sheriff Hayes might be investigating that made Morrison so uncomfortable. Their visit to the church provided another piece of the puzzle that was Millbrook. Pastor Wright was a sincere man whose genuine faith and concern for his congregation shone through every word he spoke. When he asked about Clara's background and her feelings about joining his church community, she found herself telling him more than she'd intended about her difficult life in St. Louis and her hopes for a fresh start. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Pastor Wright observed kindly. "Perhaps he brought you here for reasons beyond what you know." As he spoke these words, Clara felt a strange resonance, as if there might be more truth in them than even the pastor realized. When Morrison stepped outside to speak with some men who'd gathered near the church, Pastor Wright lowered his voice and fixed Clara with a concerned look. I hope you don't mind my asking, Miss Bennet, but are you quite certain about this marriage? Sometimes when folks rush into arrangements sight unseen, they find themselves in situations they never expected. Clara appreciated his concern, but she wasn't ready to voice her own doubts to a near stranger. Mr. Morrison seems kind enough, she said diplomatically, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Pastor Wright nodded slowly, but she could see he wasn't entirely satisfied with her answer. Well, you know you always have a place here if you need guidance or help. The church is sanctuary for all who seek it. As they left the church, Clara caught sight of Sheriff Hayes across the street, talking intently with a young deputy outside. The jail. Something about the sheriff's demeanor suggested urgency, and she found herself wondering what kind of trouble might be brewing in this seemingly peaceful town. That afternoon, Morrison suggested they visit the mayor's office so Clara could meet the man who'd done so much for Millbrook's prosperity. Mayor Blackwell received them in his well-appointed office, a space that spoke of wealth and influence far beyond what a small-town mayor might typically enjoy. The man himself was charming and articulate, welcoming Clara with practiced grace and asking polite questions about her journey and impressions of the town. But the moment Mayor Blackwell began speaking, Clara felt as if she'd been struck by lightning. The deception radiating from him was so powerful, so all-encompassing, that she had to grip the arms of her chair to keep from swaying. Every word he spoke, from his welcome to his praise of Morrison to his descriptions of Millbrook's bright future, was layered with lies so complex and deep that she couldn't begin to untangle them. We're always pleased to welcome new families to our community, Blackwell was saying, his voice smooth as honey. Millbrook is built on the principles of hard work and mutual prosperity. When the mind prospers, we all prosper. As he spoke these words, Clara felt sick to her stomach. Whatever was happening at the copper mine, it wasn't the honest enterprise Blackwell claimed it to be. The deception was so profound that she found herself studying the mayor's face, wondering how someone could lie so completely while maintaining such a convincing facade. Morrison and Blackwell chatted for several more minutes about mining operations and shipping schedules, and with each exchange, Clara's understanding of the situation grew clearer and more frightening. Morrison was involved in whatever corrupt scheme the mayor was running, though his deceptions suggested he might be more pawn than partner in the operation. As they left the mayor's office, Clara felt as if she were drowning in a sea of lies and half-truths. The town that had seemed so prosperous and welcoming was built on foundations of deception that reached from the copper mine to the highest levels of local government. And somehow she'd managed to entangle herself with a man who was part of it all. That evening, as Morrison again announced he had business in town, Clara made a decision that would change everything. Instead of remaining safely in the house, she would follow him and discover exactly what kind of business required such secrecy. Her gift had brought her nothing but trouble throughout her life, but perhaps for once it could serve a greater purpose than simply making her uncomfortable around dishonest people. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Morrison's wagon disappeared down the dark road toward town, Clara wrapped herself in a dark shawl and set out on foot, determined to learn the truth about the man she was supposed to marry and the town that seemed too good to be true. The night air was cool and filled with the sounds of distant activity, and as she walked, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to discover something that would put her in terrible danger. The lights of Millbrook grew brighter as she approached, and the sounds of evening activity drifted from the various establishments along Main Street. But instead of heading toward the obvious gathering places, Clara found herself drawn toward the sheriff's office, where a warm light burned in the window and the silhouette of a man could be seen working at a desk. Something told her that Sheriff Hayes might be the one honest man in a town full of liars, and if she was going to survive whatever web of corruption she'd stumbled into, She would need an ally who could help her separate truth from deception. As she approached the sheriff's office, Clara Bennett prepared to do something she'd never done before. Trust someone with the secret of her peculiar gift, and hope that her ability to sense lies would finally serve a purpose greater than her own survival. Clara's heart pounded as she approached the sheriff's office, her footsteps echoing softly on the wooden sidewalk. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Hayes bent over his desk, writing by lamplight. The warm glow from inside seemed to represent everything honest and safe in a town that was rapidly revealing itself to be neither. Taking a deep breath, Clara knocked gently on the door. The scratching of the pen stopped immediately, followed by the sound of a chair being pushed back. When the door opened, Sheriff Thomas Hayes stood before her, his dark eyes reflecting concern and curiosity. "Miss Bennett, isn't it?" he said, stepping back to allow her entry. "You're William Morrison's intended bride. What brings you out so late? Is everything all right?" Clara hesitated, suddenly realizing how impossible her situation would sound to a rational person. How could she explain that she possessed an ability to detect lies, or that everyone from her fiancé to the mayor seemed to be hiding dangerous secrets? But as she looked into Sheriff Hayes' honest face, she felt that familiar absence of deception that had been so rare since her arrival in Millbrook. "Sheriff Hayes, I need to speak with someone I can trust," she began carefully. "I believe there's something terribly wrong in this town, and I'm afraid I may have walked into the middle of it." Hayes gestured to a chair across from his desk, his expression serious. "Please sit down. Tell me what's troubling you." As he spoke, Clara felt nothing but genuine concern and interest, a refreshing change from the layers of deception she'd been navigating for days. Clara settled into the chair, gathering her courage. "This may sound strange, Sheriff, but I have a particular ability to sense when people aren't telling the truth. It's something I've had since childhood, though I've never spoken of it to anyone." She watched his face carefully for signs of disbelief or mockery, but found only attentive interest. "Go on," Hayes encouraged, leaning forward slightly. His response carried no trace of skepticism, only the patient attention of a man accustomed to hearing unusual stories in his line of work. "Since I arrived in Millbrook, I've been overwhelmed by the amount of deception I'm sensing from nearly everyone I meet. My fiancé, Mr. Morrison, seems to be lying about almost everything, including his late wife's death. Mayor Blackwell radiates dishonesty so strongly that being in his presence makes me physically ill. There's something corrupt happening here. Something involving the copper mine, and I believe people may be in danger." Sheriff Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on his desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "Miss Bennett, I appreciate you coming to me with this information. Your observations align with certain concerns I've been investigating, though I've been proceeding carefully due to the sensitive nature of the matter." Clara felt a rush of relief at his response. Not only did he believe her, but her suspicions were apparently well-founded. "What kind of concerns, Sheriff?" Hayes rose and moved to the window, peering out at the quiet street before drawing the curtains closed. "There have been irregularities in the mine's operation that don't add up. Production reports that don't match shipping manifests, workers who've disappeared without explanation, and financial transactions that seem to exceed what a copper mine should generate." He returned to his desk, pulling out a folder thick with papers. "I've been documenting everything, but I need more evidence before I can take action against someone as powerful as Mayor Blackwell." Clara leaned forward, fascinated despite her fear. "What kind of evidence?" "Witnesses primarily. People who've seen what's really happening at the mine. But most folks are either too scared or too well paid to talk." Hayes fixed her with an intense look. "Your ability to detect deception could be exactly what I need to separate truth from lies in the testimonies I do manage to gather." The suggestion both thrilled and terrified Clara. The idea of using her peculiar gift for something meaningful, something that could help people, was appealing beyond measure. but she was also acutely aware of the danger such an undertaking would entail. "There's something else you should know," Hayes continued, his voice dropping lower. "I believe Morrison is involved in whatever scheme Blackwell is running, though I suspect he may be more of a reluctant participant than a willing conspirator. Some of the irregular shipments have been traced to his ranch, and he's been seen meeting with known criminals who work for interests outside Millbrook." Clara's stomach clenched as her worst fears about her fiancé were confirmed. What kind of criminals? "Men who specialize in making problems disappear," Hayes said grimly. "The kind who ensure that inconvenient witnesses don't live to testify about what they've seen." He paused, studying her face. "Miss Bennett, if you're truly committed to helping expose this corruption, you need to understand that you'll be placing yourself in considerable danger. These people have killed to protect their secrets." The weight of his words settled over Clara like a heavy blanket. She thought of Morrison's deceptions about his late wife, of Mayor Blackwell's overwhelming dishonesty, of the fear she'd sensed in the townspeople despite their apparent prosperity. Whatever was happening in Millbrook was serious enough to kill for, and she was already dangerously close to the center of it. "I can't marry him," she said quietly, the realization crystallizing as she spoke. "Even if he's not a willing participant in murder, he's still lying to me about everything. And if I go through with this wedding, I'll be trapped on his ranch with no way to help anyone or protect myself." Hayes nodded soberly. "I was hoping you'd reach that conclusion. The question now is how to extract you from this situation safely, while preserving the opportunity to gather the evidence we need." Clara considered the possibilities, her mind racing through the implications of each choice. "What if I pretended to go along with the wedding plans while secretly helping you? Investigate? I could use my ability to determine which potential witnesses are telling the truth and which are hiding information." "That would be extremely dangerous," Hayes warned. "Morrison would be watching you closely, and if Blackwell suspects you're working with me, your life wouldn't be worth a plugged nickel." "But it might be our only chance to expose them before they hurt more people," Clara countered. "Besides, they already suspect something is wrong. Morrison keeps making comments about you asking too many questions, and Mayor Blackwell was studying me very carefully when we met. If I suddenly disappear or call off the wedding, they'll know someone is investigating them." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of her proposal. Finally, he looked up at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're braver than you know, Miss Bennett. But if we're going to do this, we need to establish some ground rules and safety measures." For the next hour, they developed a plan that would allow Clara to continue her engagement to Morrison while secretly assisting Hayes' investigation. She would use her ability to identify truthful witnesses among the miners and townspeople, while Hayes would provide protection and coordinate the gathering of evidence. They established a series of signals and meeting places, including Dr. Morgan's medical practice, which Hayes assured her was a safe haven. "Dr. Morgan has been treating injured miners for months," Hayes explained. "She's documented injuries that don't match the official accident reports, and she's been asking questions about the unusually high number of men who've left town suddenly after being hurt at the mine. She's discreet and trustworthy, and her medical practice gives her legitimate reasons to interact with workers and their families." Clara felt a spark of hope at the mention of another potential ally. "Can she be trusted with the truth about my ability?" "I believe so. Elizabeth Morgan is one of the most ethical people I know, and she's already risking her career by questioning the mine's safety practices. If anyone would understand the importance of your gift, it would be her." As their meeting drew to a close, Hayes walked Clara to the door, but before opening it, he placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Miss Bennett, I want you to know that what you're doing takes extraordinary courage. Many people would simply leave town and pretend they'd never seen anything wrong." Clara met his eyes, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the lamplit office. Please, call me Clara, and I couldn't live with myself if I walked away knowing that people were suffering and dying while I remained silent. Clara, he repeated, and she felt her heart skip slightly at the way her name sounded in his voice. I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. You have my word on that. As Clara made her way back through the dark streets toward Morrison's ranch, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. Less than a week ago, she'd been a lonely woman seeking nothing more than a husband and a home. Now she was embarking on a dangerous mission to expose corruption and murder, allied with a sheriff whose integrity shone like a beacon in the darkness that seemed to envelop Millbrook. The walk back to the ranch gave her time to plan how she would behave around Morrison over the next few days. She would need to seem excited about their upcoming wedding while secretly investigating his connections to Mayor Blackwood's criminal enterprise. The challenge would be maintaining her facade while using her ability to gather the information Sheriff Hayes needed. When she arrived at the ranch house, Morrison's wagon was already there, though no lights burned in the windows. Clara slipped quietly into the house and made her way to her room, relieved that she wouldn't have to face her fiancé until morning. As she lay in bed, she thought about the man she'd just left behind in town, remembering the steady strength in his voice and the complete absence of deception in everything he'd said to her. The next morning, Morrison was in an unusually good mood, humming as he prepared breakfast and chatting cheerfully about their wedding plans. But Clara's heightened awareness of his deceptions made the conversation almost unbearable. Every comment about their future together was layered with lies, and she found herself studying his face, wondering how many other women he might have deceived and what had really happened to his first wife. I thought we might ride out to look at some land today, Morrison suggested over coffee. There's a parcel north of here that might be good for expanding the horse operation. Clara agreed readily, seeing an opportunity to observe more of Morrison's activities. As they rode through the countryside, she noticed that their route took them past several mining operations and freight depots, giving Morrison opportunities to exchange subtle signals with various workers and supervisors. The deception she sensed from him grew stronger during these interactions, confirming her suspicion that his business had little to do with horses and everything to do with Mayor Blackwood's corrupt enterprises. Their destination turned out to be a remote canyon where several men were waiting with loaded wagons. Clara recognized the type immediately from Sheriff Hayes' description: hard-faced individuals whose presence suggested violence and intimidation. Morrison's demeanor changed dramatically when he saw them, the jovial rancher disappearing behind a mask of nervous anxiety. "Clara, I need you to wait here with the horses," Morrison said, his voice tense. "This is just business talk, nothing that would interest a lady." As Morrison walked toward the waiting men, Clara positioned herself where she could observe while appearing to tend to the horses. The conversation was too distant for her to hear specific words, but the body language told a clear story of fear and coercion. Morrison was clearly receiving orders rather than conducting business negotiations, and the frequent gestures toward town suggested that whatever was being planned would affect Millbrook directly. When Morrison returned to her side, his face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. The deception radiating from him was so strong that Clara felt physically sick, and she had to grip the saddle horn to keep from swaying. "Everything all right?" she asked, trying to sound casual despite her growing fear. "Of course," Morrison replied, but his voice was strained. "Just discussing shipping schedules for the horses. Nothing to worry about." The lie was so blatant and desperate that Clara wondered if Morrison was trying to convince himself as much as her. As they rode back toward the ranch, she noticed that he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to be followed. That afternoon, Clara made an excuse to visit town, claiming she needed to speak with Pastor Wright about wedding details. Morrison seemed relieved to have her away from the ranch, which only confirmed her suspicion that he was involved in activities he didn't want her to witness. Instead of going to the church, however, Clara made her way to Dr. Morgan's medical practice, a neat building on a quiet side street that offered privacy for sensitive conversations. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. When Clara explained that Sheriff Hayes had sent her, the doctor's demeanor became serious and focused. "Sheriff Hayes mentioned you might be able to help with a situation we've been investigating," Dr. Morgan said, gesturing for Clara to sit in her consultation room. "He said you have a particular talent for detecting deception." Clara explained her ability and the observations she'd made since arriving in Millbrook. Dr. Morgan listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated both her intelligence and her understanding of the dangerous situation they were facing. "I've been treating injured miners for months," Dr. Morgan said when Clara finished her explanation. "The official reports claim these are routine industrial accidents, but the injuries I'm seeing tell a different story. Men with whip marks on their backs, burns from chemicals that shouldn't be present in a copper mine, and broken bones that suggest they've been beaten rather than injured in cave-ins or equipment failures." Clara felt her stomach turn at the doctor's description. "Are they being forced to work under dangerous conditions?" "Worse than that, I believe. Some of the men have tried to tell me what's really happening, but they're too frightened to speak clearly. They hint at operations that have nothing to do with copper mining, at shipments that arrive and leave under cover of darkness, and at workers who disappear if they ask too many questions." Dr. Morgan moved to her medical cabinet and withdrew, a leather journal filled with her careful handwriting. "I've been documenting everything, but I need to know which of my patients are telling the truth and which are too scared to speak honestly. Your ability could help me separate genuine testimony from the stories they've been told to repeat." Clara agreed to help, and over the next 2 hours, she interviewed several of Dr. Morgan's patients who had agreed to speak confidentially about their experiences at the mine. Using her gift to detect deception, she was able to identify which men were telling the truth about the dangerous and illegal activities they'd witnessed. The picture that emerged was more horrifying than anything Clara had imagined. The copper mine was being used as a front for a much larger criminal operation involving the processing and shipping of stolen goods, money laundering, and the use of forced labor. Men who tried to quit or report the illegal activities were either killed outright or shipped to other locations where they disappeared permanently. Mayor Blackwood has connections to criminal organizations throughout the territory, one miner explained, his words carrying the unmistakable ring of truth that Clara had learned to recognize. "The mine is just one piece of a network that reaches from Denver to San Francisco. Local law enforcement in most towns is either bought off or intimidated into silence." Clara's heart sank as she realized the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just local corruption, but part of a criminal enterprise so large and well-connected that even Sheriff Hayes might not be able to combat it effectively. As evening approached, Clara prepared to return to Morrison's ranch, her mind reeling from everything she'd learned. Dr. Morgan walked her to the door, her expression grave. "Clara, I want you to know that what you're doing is incredibly brave. But it's also extremely dangerous," the doctor said quietly. "The people we're investigating have killed to protect their secrets, and they won't hesitate to kill again if they feel threatened." Clara nodded, understanding the risk but feeling more determined than ever to see the investigation through to its conclusion. "Dr. Morgan, there's something else I need to tell you. I believe my fiance's first wife may not have died of consumption as he claims. The deception I sense when he speaks of her death suggests something much more sinister." Dr. Morgan's face darkened with understanding. "I treated Sarah Morrison during her final illness, and you're right to be suspicious. The symptoms she presented weren't consistent with consumption, and she was terrified of something in the days before her death. She tried to tell me something important, but she died before she could explain what was frightening her." The confirmation of her suspicion sent a chill through Clara. If Morrison had killed his first wife, either directly or through his involvement with Blackwood's criminal organization, then her own life was in immediate danger. "What should I do?" Clara asked, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. "Continue to play your part, but be extremely careful, Doctor," Morgan advised. "Sheriff Hayes and I will work on gathering more evidence, but we need you to maintain your cover until we can move against them safely. In the meantime, trust your instincts. If you sense immediate danger, get away from Morrison immediately and come here or to the sheriff's office." As Clara walked back through the darkening streets toward Morrison's waiting wagon, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in just a few days. The quiet existence she'd hoped to find in Millbrook had transformed into a deadly game of deception and danger, where her peculiar gift might be the key to exposing a criminal conspiracy that threatened the entire community. The lights of Morrison's ranch house came into view as they rode through the gathering darkness, and Clara steeled herself for another evening of pretending to be an eager bride, while secretly planning to help destroy the man she was supposed to marry. The weight of her double life was becoming almost unbearable, but the thought of Sheriff Hayes' honest face and Dr. Morgan's courageous dedication to her patients gave her the strength to continue. Whatever happened next, Clara Bennett was no longer the frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the train just days before. She was becoming something she'd never imagined herself capable of being, a woman willing to risk everything to protect innocent people and ensure that justice prevailed over corruption and murder. The morning of Clara's supposed wedding dawned gray and cold, with threatening clouds gathering over the mountains surrounding Millbrook. As she dressed in the simple white dress that Morrison had insisted she wear, Clara's hands trembled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Today would bring the confrontation she'd been dreading and preparing for, the moment when her carefully maintained facade would either save lives or cost her own. Morrison had been increasingly agitated over the past 2 days, receiving frequent visitors at odd hours and holding hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever Clara appeared. The deception radiating from him had grown so intense that she could barely stand to be in the same room, and she'd taken to spending long hours walking the property to escape the suffocating atmosphere of lies that surrounded him. The previous evening, Sheriff Hayes had managed to pass her a message through Dr. Morgan, informing her that federal marshals were en route to Millbrook and would arrive within hours of the wedding ceremony. The plan was for Clara to gather as much evidence as possible during the wedding reception, when alcohol would loosen tongues and lower guards, while Hayes and his allies prepared to move against Mayor Blackwell and his criminal network. As Clara pinned her grandmother's cameo to her dress, she thought about the woman who had first helped her understand her peculiar gift. "Truth has a weight to it, child," her grandmother had often said. "Lies float on the surface like scum on a pond, but truth sinks deep and stays put." Today, Clara would discover whether the truth she'd uncovered about Millbrook would be enough to sink the corruption that had poisoned the town. Morrison appeared at her door precisely at 9 o'clock, dressed in his finest suit and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that might have been romantic under different circumstances. His smile was broad and seemingly genuine, but Clara could feel the desperate fear underlying his cheerful demeanor. Whatever role he was playing in today's events, he was terrified of the consequences of failure. "You look beautiful, Clara," he said, offering her his arm. "Ready to become Mrs. Morrison?" Clara forced herself to smile and accept his escort, though touching him made her skin crawl with the intensity of his deceptions. "I'm ready, William. Though I must admit I'm nervous about meeting so many new people at once." As they rode toward town in Morrison's decorated wagon, Clara observed the unusual amount of activity on the roads. More freight wagons than normal were heading toward the mine, and she noticed several groups of hard-faced men who didn't look like typical wedding guests. The criminal network was clearly using her wedding as cover for some major operation, which meant that lives beyond her own hung in the balance. The church was packed when they arrived, filled with faces Clara recognized from her visits to town over the past week. Mayor Blackwood sat in the front row, resplendent in an expensive suit and radiating the same overwhelming dishonesty that had nearly made her ill during their first meeting. Pastor Wright stood at the altar, his honest face troubled as he watched Morrison escort Clara down the aisle. As the ceremony began, Clara found herself studying the congregation, using her gift to gauge the mood and intentions of the assembled crowd. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. Nearly half the attendees were generating the same deceptive aura she'd learned to associate with Blackwell's criminal associates, while the genuine townspeople seemed nervous and frightened, as if they sensed danger but couldn't identify its source. Pastor Wright's voice carried clearly through the packed church as he began the traditional wedding ceremony, but Clara noticed subtle changes in his usual words. Instead of focusing solely on the joy of marriage, he spoke repeatedly about truth, justice, and the importance of standing up for what was right, even in the face of danger. His eyes met hers several times during these passages, and she realized he was trying to give her strength for whatever was about to unfold. When Pastor Wright reached the part of the ceremony where he asked if anyone objected to the union, Clara held her breath, half hoping and half fearing that Sheriff Hayes would burst through the doors to stop the proceedings. Instead, the church remained silent except for the rustle of uncomfortable shifting from some of the congregation. "William Morrison," Pastor Wright continued, his voice taking on an unusual intensity, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and protect her, to be honest and faithful to her, for as long as you both shall live?" Morrison's response carried such powerful deception that Clara swayed on her feet, and she had to grip Pastor Wright's arm to keep from falling. Whatever vows Morrison was making, he had no intention of keeping them and the malevolence behind. His lies suggested that her life expectancy as his wife would be measured in days rather than years. "I do," Morrison said, his voice steady despite the lies that surrounded his words like a poisonous cloud. Pastor Wright turned to Clara, and she saw something in his eyes that looked like an apology. "Clara Bennett, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and honor him, to be faithful and true to him, for as long as you both shall live?" Clara opened her mouth to speak the expected words, but what came out instead shocked everyone in the church, including herself. "I cannot make vows based on deception, Pastor Wright. This man has lied to me about everything since the moment I arrived in Millbrook, including the circumstances of his first wife's death." The church erupted in gasps and murmurs, but Clara continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally spoke the truth she'd been hiding for days. "Mayor Blackwell, you're using this wedding as cover for criminal activities, and you've been running illegal operations through the copper mine for months. People have died to protect your secrets, and more will die if someone doesn't expose what you're doing." Morrison's face had gone white with shock and fear, while Mayor Blackwell rose slowly from his seat, his expression dark with rage. "Young lady, I don't know what's gotten into you, but these are serious accusations that could get you into considerable trouble." Clara felt the familiar electric sensation that preceded her most powerful moments of clarity, and when she looked at Blackwell, she could see his deceptions laid out like a map of corruption that stretched far beyond Millbrook. "You're not even primarily interested in the copper, are you, Mayor? The mine is just a convenient way to launder money and ship stolen goods throughout the territory. You've been using forced labor and murdering anyone who threatens to expose your operation." The atmosphere in the church had shifted dramatically, with the genuine townspeople looking shocked and frightened while Blackwell's associates began moving toward the exits. Clara realized that her outburst had forced events to accelerate beyond anyone's control, and she found herself at the center of a confrontation that could turn deadly in seconds. "Sheriff Hayes," Blackwell called loudly, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "I think Miss Bennet is suffering from some kind of hysteria. Perhaps she should be taken into protective custody until a doctor can examine her mental state." But Sheriff Hayes was nowhere to be seen, and Clara felt a moment of panic as she wondered if something had happened to the one man she'd counted on to protect her. Morrison grabbed her arm roughly, his earlier pretense of gentleness completely abandoned. "Clara's been under a lot of stress," Morrison said quickly, his voice shaken with barely controlled fear. "The long journey, the wedding preparations, it's all been too much for her delicate constitution. I think I should take her home to rest." The deception in his words was so blatant that Clara wondered how anyone could believe him, but she realized that most of the congregation couldn't sense what she could. To them, Morrison's explanation probably sounded reasonable, while her accusations seemed like the ravings of an overwrought bride. Dr. Morgan suddenly appeared at Clara's side, her medical bag in hand and her face set with determination. "As the attending physician, I believe Miss Bennet is suffering from acute stress, but her mental faculties are perfectly sound. If anyone should examine her, it should be me, in the privacy of my medical practice." Mayor Blackwell's face darkened further at the doctor's intervention. "Dr. Morgan, you've been making a lot of inappropriate inquiries lately about matters that don't concern you. Perhaps it's time someone looked into your medical credentials and fitness to practice in this community." The threat was barely veiled, but Dr. Morgan stood her ground. "My credentials are in perfect order, Mayor Blackwell, and my duty is to the health and welfare of my patients, not to political convenience." As the confrontation escalated, Clara noticed that many of Blackwell's associates had quietly left the church, suggesting that whatever operation they'd been planning was now in jeopardy. The thought gave her hope, but she also realized that desperate criminals were extremely dangerous, especially when cornered. Pastor Wright stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Perhaps we should postpone this wedding until Miss Bennet has had time to recover from her distress. The church is meant to be a place of peace and contemplation, not conflict and accusation." Morrison's grip on Clara's arm tightened painfully. "There's no need to postpone anything. Clara just needs some fresh air and a chance to calm down. We can finish the ceremony later, in private." The lies in his words were so aggressive that Clara felt physically sick, and she realized that Morrison intended to take her somewhere isolated, where her accusations could be silenced permanently. She tried to pull away from him, but his grip was surprisingly strong for a man who claimed to be a simple rancher. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Clara said loudly, hoping to alert the remaining congregation to her danger. "You killed your first wife, didn't you? She found out about your involvement with Mayor Blackwell's criminal activities, and you silenced her before she could expose you." Morrison's face went from white to red as rage replaced fear in his expression. "You don't know what you're talking about, Clara. Sarah died of consumption, just like I told you." But Dr. Morgan stepped forward again, her voice clear and authoritative. "Actually, Mr. Morrison, I treated your wife during her final illness, and her symptoms were not consistent with consumption. She showed signs of poisoning, specifically the type caused by arsenic administered over a period of weeks." The revelation sent another wave of shock through the congregation, and Clara saw several of the townspeople backing toward the exits as they realized they were witnessing something far more serious than a bride's pre-wedding nerves. Mayor Blackwell moved closer to the altar, his hand resting on something concealed beneath his coat. "Dr. Morgan, you're making very serious accusations without proof. I think it would be wise for you to reconsider your position." "My position is based on medical evidence and sworn testimony from witnesses," Dr. Morgan replied steadily. "Evidence that's already been shared with federal authorities, who are investigating criminal activities in this territory." Clara felt a surge of hope at the doctor's words, realizing that Hayes and his allies had been more thorough in their preparations than she'd known. But Blackwell's reaction to the mention of federal authorities was immediate and violent. You meddling witch, he snarled, pulling a derringer from his coat and pointing it at Dr. Morgan. You've ruined months of careful planning with your interference. The church erupted in screams and chaos as people dove for cover behind pews and rushed toward the exits. Morrison used the confusion to drag Clara toward a side door, but she fought against him with desperate strength, knowing that leaving the church would likely mean her death. "Help me!" Clara shouted over the noise, but most of the congregation was too focused on their own escape to notice her plight. Pastor Wright started toward her, but Morrison pulled out his own weapon and pointed it in the pastor's direction. "Stay back, preacher man," Morrison warned. "This doesn't concern you." But Pastor Wright continued advancing, his face set with righteous anger. "It concerns me greatly when violence is threatened in God's house. Let the woman go, Morrison. Whatever you're involved in, it's not worth adding murder to your crimes." Clara felt Morrison's grip loosen slightly as he focused on the approaching pastor, and she used the opportunity to break free and run toward the main aisle. Behind her, she heard Morrison curse and give chase, while Mayor Blackwell continued threatening Dr. Morgan with his weapon. As Clara reached the center of the church, the main doors burst open, and Sheriff Hayes entered with several armed men, wearing federal marshal badges. The sight of law enforcement caused another wave of panic among Blackwell's remaining associates, but also brought hope to the terrified townspeople. "Drop your weapons," Hayes commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You're all under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and violation of federal interstate commerce laws." Mayor Blackwell's response was to grab the nearest innocent bystander, an elderly woman who had been too slow to escape the chaos, and hold his derringer to her head. "I don't think so, Sheriff. Unless you want this lady's death on your conscience, you'll let us walk out of here." Clara watched the standoff unfold with growing desperation, realizing that her outburst had created exactly the kind of hostage situation that could end in multiple deaths. Her gift for detecting lies had exposed the corruption in Millbrook, but it had also escalated the situation beyond anyone's ability to control peacefully. Morrison, meanwhile, had cornered Pastor Wright near the altar, his weapon trained on the minister who had refused to let him drag Clara away. "You should have minded your own business, preacher," Morrison snarled. "Now you're going to be a casualty of circumstances beyond your control." Clara felt a moment of crystalline clarity, as she realized that her peculiar gift might offer a solution to the deadly standoff. Throughout her life, she'd focused on detecting deception in others, but she'd never considered whether she might be able to use that ability more actively. Taking a deep breath, Clara stepped into the center of the church where both Morrison and Blackwell could see her clearly. "Wait," she called out, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Before anyone does something they can't undo, there's something you all need to understand about what's really happening here." All eyes turned to her, and Clara felt the weight of multiple lives hanging on her next words. She had one chance to use her gift not just to detect lies, but to expose them so completely that even the most desperate criminal would realize the futility of continued deception. "Mayor Blackwell," Clara said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "you're not just threatening to kill that woman to escape justice. You're threatening to kill her because you're terrified that the federal investigation has uncovered evidence of crimes far worse than anyone in this room imagines." Blackwell's face went white at her words, confirming Clara's intuition that the corruption in Millbrook was just the tip of a much larger criminal iceberg. "And Morrison," Clara continued, turning to face her would-be husband, "you're not pointing that gun at Pastor Wright because you're brave or desperate. You're doing it because you know that if you're taken alive, you'll have to face the families of all the people you've helped disappear, including your own wife." Morrison's weapon wavered as Clara's words hit their mark, and she pressed her advantage. "The truth is that both of you are already dead men," Clara said with quiet certainty. "Your criminal associates have been abandoning you since the moment I spoke up, because they know that federal marshals don't come to places like Millbrook unless they already have enough evidence to hang everyone involved. As if to underscore her words, the sound of multiple gunshots erupted from outside the church, followed by shouts and the thunder of horses' hooves. The criminal network was clearly collapsing under federal pressure, leaving Blackwell and Morrison isolated and without support. Sheriff Hayes took advantage of the distraction to move closer to Blackwell, while one of the federal marshals positioned himself to assist Pastor Wright if Morrison's attention wavered further. "It's over," Clara said simply, looking directly into Blackwell's eyes. "The only question now is whether you're going to add more murders to your tally before you face justice, or whether you're going to let these innocent people live." For a long moment, the church was silent, except for the distant sounds of conflict outside. Then, slowly, Mayor Blackwell's arm began to lower, and Clara knew that her gamble had succeeded. The truth, delivered with absolute conviction and perfect timing, had accomplished what force alone might not have achieved. The crisis was far from over, but Clara Bennett had discovered that her gift for detecting lies could be transformed into a weapon for truth that was more powerful than any gun. The moment Mayor Blackwell's weapon lowered, Sheriff Hayes moved with lightning precision, disarming the corrupt politician while federal marshals secured Morrison and the remaining criminal associates scattered throughout the church. Clara watched as the man who had terrorized Millbrook for months was finally brought to justice, his face a mask of defeat and disbelief as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Morrison offered no resistance when Deputy Coleman approached him, the fight seeming to drain out of him completely as the reality of his situation became undeniable. As he was led away, he looked back at Clara with an expression that might have been regret or simply fear of what awaited him in federal custody. "Are you hurt?" Sheriff Hayes asked, moving quickly to Clara's side as the church began to empty of frightened townspeople and federal law enforcement officers processed the arrested criminals. Clara shook her head, though she felt unsteady on her feet as the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation began to fade. "I'm fine, thanks to you and the marshals arriving when you did. How did you know to bring federal help?" Hayes helped her to sit on one of the church pews, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Dr. Morgan and I sent word to Denver 3 days ago about what we'd discovered. The federal marshals have been tracking this criminal network for months, but they needed local witnesses and evidence to move against it effectively." Dr. Morgan approached them, her medical bag in hand and her face etched with concern. "Clara, you took an enormous risk confronting them like that. If Sheriff Hayes hadn't arrived when he did, you could have been killed." "I couldn't stand by and let innocent people be hurt," Clara replied, accepting the cup of water Dr. Morgan offered her. "Besides, I realized that my ability to detect lies might be useful for more than just identifying deception. Sometimes the truth, spoken at the right moment, can be more powerful than any weapon." Pastor Wright joined their small group, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Miss Bennett, I want you to know how grateful I am for your courage. When you spoke up during the ceremony, you prevented me from unknowingly sanctifying a union built on lies and murder." Clara looked around the now nearly empty church, its peaceful atmosphere slowly returning as the last of the law enforcement officers completed their work. "Pastor Wright, I need to ask you something. Did you suspect that something was wrong with this wedding?" The minister nodded gravely. "I've been troubled by inconsistencies in Morrison's story for weeks. When he first approached me about the ceremony, his explanations about his courtship and your background didn't align with what I observed when I met you. Your character and Morrison's descriptions of you seemed to be describing two entirely different people." Sheriff Hayes leaned forward with interest. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Morrison claimed that Clara was eager to marry quickly and start a family immediately, but when I spoke with her directly, she seemed more interested in getting to know the community and establishing herself gradually. He also said she was from a wealthy family in St. Louis, but her dress and possessions suggested more modest circumstances. Clara felt a chill as she realized how thoroughly Morrison had been lying about her even before their wedding day. He was creating a false narrative about me to support whatever plan he and Blackwell had developed. Dr. Morgan pulled out her leather journal and flipped through several pages of notes. Based on what we've learned from the arrested criminals, it appears that Morrison was supposed to murder you after the wedding and claim that you died in an accident, similar to what happened to his first wife. Your death would have provided cover for a major shipment of stolen goods that was scheduled to leave Millbrook tonight. The casual way Dr. Morgan delivered this information made Clara's blood run cold. She had come within hours, perhaps minutes, of becoming another victim of the criminal network that had been terrorizing the region for months. "There's something else you should know," Sheriff Hayes said, his expression serious. "The federal marshals found evidence at Morrison's ranch that suggests he's been involved in multiple murders over the past 2 years. You weren't his first mail-order bride, Clara. You were just the latest in a series of women he'd been recruited to eliminate." Clara felt sick at the thought of other women who had made the same journey she had, full of hope for a new life, only to find death waiting for them in the Colorado mountains. How many others were there? "At least 4 that we can document, possibly more," Hayes replied grimly. "Morrison would marry them, kill them after a few weeks or months, and then use their deaths to justify increased privacy and security around his ranch. It was the perfect cover for his role in Blackwell's smuggling operation." Pastor Wright's face was pale with horror. "To think that I might have performed wedding ceremonies for some of those poor women, unknowingly blessing unions that were meant to end in murder." Dr. Morgan reached over and squeezed the pastor's hand comfortingly. "You couldn't have known, Samuel. These people were expert at maintaining their facades. If Clara hadn't possessed her unique ability to detect deception, we might never have uncovered the truth." The mention of her gift reminded Clara of something that had been troubling her since the confrontation in the church. "Sheriff Hayes, when I was facing down Blackwell and Morrison, I felt like my ability had changed somehow. Instead of just sensing their lies, I could see the truth behind them, almost like a map of their deceptions and crimes." Hayes studied her with interest. "Can you still sense that now, or was it just the intensity of the moment?" Clara concentrated, trying to recapture the sensation she'd experienced during the crisis. As she focused, she became aware of the emotional states of everyone around her with unusual clarity. Pastor Wright's relief and residual fear, Dr. Morgan's concerned satisfaction at justice being served, and Sheriff Hayes' complex mixture of professional accomplishment and personal attraction to her. "It's still there," Clara said wonderingly. "But it's different now, more refined. Instead of just knowing when someone is lying, I can sense the deeper truths about their character and motivations." Dr. Morgan leaned forward with scientific interest. "Trauma and extreme stress can sometimes enhance latent psychic abilities. It's possible that the danger you face today triggered a development in your gift that might not have occurred under normal circumstances." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation as one of the federal marshals entered the church. Marshal Davidson was a tall, weathered man whose badge and bearing suggested years of experience dealing with dangerous criminals. "Miss Bennett," Marshal Davidson said, touching his hat respectfully, "I wanted to personally thank you for your courage today. Without your willingness to expose these criminals, we might have lost months gathering enough evidence to move against them." Clara stood to acknowledge his thanks, though she still felt unsteady. Marshal Davidson, Sheriff Hayes mentioned that this criminal network extends beyond Millbrook. "How extensive is their operation?" The marshal's expression grew grave. "Larger than we initially suspected. Blackwell's organization has connections to criminal enterprises throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah territories. They've been involved in everything from cattle rustling and bank robbery to human trafficking and murder for hire." The scope of the criminal network was staggering. And Clara realized that her decision to trust Sheriff Hayes and expose Morrison's deceptions had implications far beyond the safety of Millbrook's residents. "What happens to the town now?" Clara asked. "With so many of the local leaders involved in criminal activity, how will Millbrook recover?" Marshal Davidson glanced at Sheriff Hayes before responding. "That's actually something we wanted to discuss with you, Miss Bennett. Your unique abilities could be invaluable in helping us identify other members of the network and ensuring that we've rooted out all the corruption." The suggestion both intrigued and worried Clara. After years of hiding her gift and trying to live a normal life, the idea of using it openly to serve justice was appealing. But she was also aware of the dangers such work would entail. "What exactly would that involve?" she asked carefully. Sheriff Hayes answered before the marshal could respond. "The federal government is offering you a position as a special consultant to help with ongoing investigations. You'd be working with law enforcement across the region," the marshal said, "to uncover corruption and crimes that regular investigations can't reach." Clara felt a surge of both excitement and hesitation at the opportunity. "What about Millbrook?" she asked. "What happens to the people here, the ones who suffered because of all this?" Dr. Morgan gave her a warm, reassuring smile. "That's exactly why you're the right choice, Clara. You're not just focused on catching the guilty, you care about justice." Pastor Wright added with a gentle nod, "You've already done more for this town than anyone could have expected. No matter what you decide, Millbrook will always be your home." His words struck a chord deep within her. In this quiet, remote town, Clara had found something she'd never truly known: acceptance. A place where she wasn't feared or dismissed, but valued. "I'll need some time to think about the federal offer," Clara said at last. "Right now, my priority is helping Millbrook heal safely." Marshal Davidson gave a respectful nod. "Of course. The offer stands when you're ready. For now, we'll need your full account, everything you saw and experienced." As he turned to go, Clara paused. "Marshal, what about Morrison and Mayor Blackwood?" "They'll face federal charges: murder, conspiracy, violations of interstate law," he replied. "With the evidence we've got, they're looking at life in prison. Possibly even the death penalty." The finality of his words should have brought her peace. Instead, Clara only felt sorrow. So many lives destroyed by ambition and greed. Morrison, in particular, had shown brief moments of humanity, but his decisions had led him too far down a dark path. Once the marshal had gone, Clara remained in the church with Sheriff Hayes, Dr. Morgan, and Pastor Wright. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting warm, gentle colors across the floorboards. "Thomas," Dr. Morgan said, addressing the sheriff with a familiar tone, "you should probably take Clara to the Silver Dollar. She needs somewhere safe to rest while she thinks things through." Clara realized she hadn't thought about where she'd sleep. Returning to Morrison's ranch was out of the question, and she had no other home in town. "Actually," Sheriff Hayes said, hesitating slightly, "my sister Martha's been getting a room ready for you at our house. She says any woman brave enough to stand up to Blackwell deserves a place where she's treated like family." Clara was deeply touched. True kindness had been rare in her life. "Please thank her for me. I'd be honored to stay." As they stepped out of the church, Pastor Wright stopped Clara one last time. "Miss Bennett," he said gently, "your courage reminded me why I chose to become a minister. Sometimes we're not placed where we'll be saved, but where we're needed most to help others find their way." Clara's eyes stung with tears. Her gift had always felt like a burden, something that kept her apart. But in Millbrook, it had become a tool for justice, for protecting the innocent and holding the guilty accountable. She and Sheriff Hayes walked quietly through the hushed streets. Federal agents were still finishing their work, and most residents were keeping to their homes. "Clara," Hazes said, his voice low and sincere, "what you did today, it was the bravest thing I've ever seen." You risked everything for people you barely knew. Not even certain help would come. His words warmed her, but beneath them she felt something deeper, something more personal than professional respect. "Thomas," she asked softly, "can I ask you something?" He nodded, though the tension in his stance gave him away. "When you look at me, do you see someone useful for law enforcement? Or do you see me, Clara Bennett?" They stopped. In front of a neat little house, framed by a white fence and blooming autumn flowers. He turned toward her, his gaze steady and sincere. "I see an extraordinary woman," he said quietly. "Someone with a rare gift, someone who stands for truth, puts others first, and does what's right, even when it's dangerous." Her heart skipped. There was no mistaking the emotion in his voice. "And the gift?" she asked. "Doesn't it bother you that I can sense things most people would rather keep hidden?" He smiled a warm, genuine smile that softened his usually serious face. "I've spent my life trying to expose lies. Having someone beside me who shares that mission, that makes us stronger." The message behind his words was unmistakable. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future, not just one of safety and purpose, but of connection. Even love. Before they could knock, the door opened. A woman in her 30s, clearly Hayes's, Sister Martha, greeted them with a kind smile. Her features echoed her brother's, steady, warm, and welcoming. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and embraced Clara. "We're so glad you're here." And for the first time in her life, Clara believed it. "Clara Bennett," Martha said, stepping back to study her guest, "you are exactly what this family has been praying for, even if we didn't know it until today." As Clara crossed the threshold into the Hayes home, she realized that her journey was far from over. Whether she accepted the federal position or chose to remain in Millbrook, her life would never again be the quiet, hidden existence she had once sought. Instead, she would use her gift to serve something greater than herself, surrounded by people who valued her for exactly who she was. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train just days earlier no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had found her calling, her courage, and quite possibly her heart's desire in the most unlikely of circumstances. 6 months had passed since the dramatic events at Millbrook's church, and Clara Bennett stood at the window of the federal courthouse in Denver, watching the autumn leaves dance in the crisp mountain air. Today marked the final day of trials for Mayor Blackwood and his criminal associates, bringing closure to a chapter of her life that had transformed everything she thought she knew about herself and her future. The testimony Clara had provided during the trials had been instrumental in securing convictions against 12 members of the criminal network, including Morrison and Blackwood himself. Her unique ability to detect deception had proven invaluable, not only in identifying lies during witness testimony, but in uncovering additional evidence that conventional investigation methods had missed. Marshal Davidson approached her as she stood lost in thought, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. "Miss Bennett, the jury has reached their verdict. Blackwood and Morrison will both face life imprisonment, and the lesser members of their organization received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. Clara nodded, feeling a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but she couldn't forget that real people's lives had been destroyed by the choices these men had made. What about the families of their victims? Will they receive any compensation for their losses? The federal government has established a fund using seized assets from the criminal organization, Marshal Davidson explained. It won't bring back the people who died, but it should help their surviving family members rebuild their lives. As they walked through the courthouse corridors, Clara reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. After accepting the federal position as a special consultant, she had spent the past 6 months traveling throughout Colorado and Wyoming territories, working with law enforcement agencies to identify corruption and criminal activity. Her enhanced abilities had continued to develop, allowing her to not only detect deception, but to sense the deeper motivations and character traits that drove people's actions. The work had been dangerous and emotionally demanding, but it had also given Clara a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. Instead of hiding her gift and feeling isolated by it, she was now using it to protect innocent people and ensure that justice prevailed over corruption. Thomas Hayes was waiting for her outside the courthouse, his familiar presence bringing warmth to the cold Denver afternoon. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened beyond professional collaboration into something far more personal and meaningful. His unwavering support for her work and his complete acceptance of her abilities had created a foundation of trust and love that Clara had never dared to hope for. "How did it go?" Thomas asked, taking her hand as they walked toward their hotel. "Justice was served," Clara replied, though her tone carried a note of melancholy. "But I can't help thinking about all the people who suffered while these criminals operated with impunity. If I had arrived in Millbrook even a few weeks later, how many more lives might have been lost?" Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her, his honest eyes reflecting the deep understanding that had drawn her to him from their first meeting. "Clara, you can't save everyone, and you can't undo the past. What matters is that you're using your gift to make the future safer for countless people." His words echoed similar conversations they had shared over the months, as Clara struggled to balance her desire to help everyone with the practical limitations of what one person could accomplish. Thomas had become not only her partner-in-law, enforcement work, but her anchor in moments when the weight of her responsibilities threatened to overwhelm her. As they entered their hotel, Clara made a decision that had been building in her mind for weeks. "Thomas, I've been thinking about Marshal Davidson's offer to establish a permanent position for me with the Federal Marshal Service." Thomas's expression grew serious, recognizing the importance of what she was considering. "What are your thoughts about it?" Clara sat down in the comfortable chair by the window, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "The work is important, and I know I can make a real difference in fighting corruption and crime throughout the territories. But there's something else I need to consider now." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "I need to consider what kind of life I want to build." Thomas moved closer, his voice gentle but intense. "Clara, whatever you decide about your career, I want you to know that my feelings for you aren't dependent on your professional choices. Whether you work with the federal marshals or decide to do something entirely different, I'll support whatever makes you happy." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, carrying none of the deception that had characterized every other man who had claimed to care about her. Clara felt her heart swell with the certainty that Thomas Hayes was not only an honest lawman, but an honest man whose love for her was genuine and unconditional. "There's something I need to tell you," Clara said, reaching for his hand. "Over these past months, working together and traveling throughout the territory, I've realized that my gift isn't just about detecting lies or serving justice. It's also helped me recognize the rarest truth of all." Thomas waited patiently for her to continue, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "It's helped me recognize genuine love when I find it," Clara said softly. "Thomas, I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You've shown me that I don't have to choose between using my abilities and having a normal life. With you, I can be exactly who I am." The smile that spread across Thomas's face was like sunrise after a long night. "Clara Bennett, I've been waiting for the right moment to say this, but there might never be a perfect time." He dropped to one knee beside her chair, pulling a simple gold ring from his pocket. "Will you marry me? Not because it's convenient or practical, but because I love you with all my heart, and I want to spend the rest of my life supporting your dreams and sharing your adventures." Clara felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she looked at the man who had believed in her when she'd barely believed in herself. "Yes, Thomas Hayes. Yes, I'll marry you." As Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, Clara marveled at how different this proposal felt from the deceptive arrangement she had made with Morrison. This time, her gift confirmed what her heart already knew. Every word Thomas spoke was completely truthful. Every promise he made was genuine, and the love he offered was as real and solid as the mountains surrounding them. Their kiss was interrupted by a knock at the door, and Marshal Davidson entered with a telegram in his hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but this just arrived from Washington. It's about your future with the Marshal Service." Clara accepted the telegram with curiosity, wondering what news could be important enough to interrupt their engagement celebration. As she read the message, her eyes widened with surprise. "What is it?" Thomas asked, moving to read over her shoulder. "The federal government wants to establish a new division specifically focused on investigating corruption using unconventional methods," Clara explained, her voice filled with excitement. "They're offering me the position of chief investigator, with the authority to recruit and train other people who have abilities similar to mine." Marshal Davidson nodded approvingly. "The success of your work over the past 6 months has convinced the higher-ups that there are probably other people out there with gifts that could be valuable to law enforcement. Your job would be to find them and teach them how to use their abilities effectively." The implications of the offer were staggering. Instead of working alone as a consultant, Clara would be able to build an entire organization dedicated to fighting corruption and protecting innocent people. It was an opportunity to make her work sustainable and far-reaching in ways she had never imagined. "There's one condition," Clara said, looking up at Thomas. "I would only accept if I could choose my own deputy chief investigator." Thomas's eyes sparkled with understanding. "Are you offering me a job, Miss Bennett?" "I'm offering you a partnership." "In every sense of the word," Clara replied. "Professional and personal. We work better together than either of us works alone." Marshal Davidson smiled at their exchange. "I think that arrangement could be very satisfactory to all parties involved." "Sheriff Hayes, are you interested in joining the Federal Marshal Service?" Thomas looked at Clara, then back at the Marshal. "If it means I can continue working with the most remarkable woman I've ever met while serving justice throughout the territory, then yes, I'm very interested." 3 weeks later, Clara and Thomas were married in the same church where she had exposed Mayor Blackwell's criminal network. Pastor Wright performed the ceremony with obvious joy, surrounded by the entire population of Millbrook and several federal marshals who had become close friends during the investigation. Dr. Morgan served as Clara's matron of honor, while Martha Hayes stood beside her brother as his best woman. The ceremony was simple but profound, with vows that carried the weight of shared purpose and genuine love. As Clara walked down the aisle as Mrs. Thomas Hayes, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the train months earlier had discovered not only her true calling, but her perfect partner in life. During the reception at the Silver Dollar Inn, Clara found herself surrounded by the people who had become her chosen family. The citizens of Millbrook had embraced her completely, recognizing that her courage had saved their community from continued exploitation and murder. "So what's next for the famous lie detector and her honest sheriff?" Martha Hayes asked as the evening wound down. Clara exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas before answering. "We're going to travel throughout the Western Territories, seeking out others who have been hiding gifts similar to mine. We'll teach them that their abilities are blessings, not curses, and show them how to use those gifts to protect people who can't protect themselves." Dr. Morgan raised her glass in a toast. "To Clara and Thomas Hayes, may your work bring justice to the lawless and hope to the hopeless." As the gathered friends and family echoed the toast, Clara felt her gift stirring in a new way. Instead of sensing deception, she was overwhelmed by the genuine love and respect surrounding her. For the first time in her life, she was in a room full of people who accepted her completely for who she was. Later that evening, as Clara and Thomas sat on the porch of their new home overlooking Millbrook, she reflected on the changes her gift had undergone since that first terrifying day in the church. What had once been a burden that isolated her from others had become a tool for connection and justice. Do you ever regret that your quiet life as a sheriff got turned upside down by a woman with strange abilities? Clara asked, leaning against Thomas's shoulder. Thomas chuckled softly, his arm tightening around her. Clara, my life was never quiet, just lonely. You didn't turn it upside down, you made it complete. As they watched the stars emerge over the Colorado mountains, Clara thought about all the people still out there who were hiding gifts similar to hers, afraid that their abilities made them freaks or outcasts. Tomorrow, she and Thomas would begin the work of finding those people and showing them that their differences could be sources of strength rather than shame. The mail-order bride who had come to Millbrook seeking nothing more than a husband and a home had instead found her true purpose and a love built on absolute honesty. Clara Bennett Hayes had learned that the greatest truths in life weren't the lies she could detect, but the genuine connections she could build when she stopped hiding who she really was. In a world full of deception and corruption, Clara and Thomas Hayes would stand as guardians of truth, using their combined gifts of discernment and integrity to ensure that justice prevailed over those who would prey upon the innocent. Their love story had begun with lies exposed in a church, but it would continue with truths discovered across the vast frontier, bringing hope and protection to everyone whose path they crossed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.